I'm just a little concerned that like all of our rush, like you're talking about, like you having a concentration of a few individuals that are making all the choices. And they're sort of saying, well, we're doing all this so that the rest of you can have this great future. But yet, why not still be accountable for here on Earth, treating labor well, treating, your teams well. If you've got a logistics company, i.e. something like Amazon, which people are becoming more dependent and fragile on. And if there's some issue within, then there's all sorts of other dependencies or bottlenecks that you don't even know might get affected. And you've got the environmental issues, and you can say, oh, well, like they've got policies and they've got a department. So going, well, maybe that's not good enough. Maybe there's something greater that has to, because I think this stuff has to happen parallel. My wife, I don't know if she's going to want to be quoted here, but she heard in the documentary that part of one of the high-profile individuals' goals is to extend consciousness in space into the solar system. And I joked about some trolling that this individual was doing against another high-profile person just this past week on Twitter. And she said, that's not a good example of bringing consciousness into the solar system. So there is no perfect human, but I'm saying but if you're going to have this kind of standard where you are trying to do this really magnanimous thing, I think other parts of your life and business practice and stuff might want to be a little bit reflective of that higher base.
Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. Back in 2007, I had one of my most profound and otherworldly dreams, which ended with this kind of apocalyptic vision. I looked up and saw that the entire night sky was occluded behind a grid of dots, pixels. Most of them were dark, but a few were illuminated, and they read, like a digital clock, 8:33. Now in that dream, I knew that this was a kind of turning point, a revelatory moment, that we were being shown something, that there would be no turning back. And I thought about that dream just a couple weeks ago when I was in Wichita visiting family. My brother is an aerospace engineering student, and the conversation in this episode with Robert Jacobson assuredly grew out of the conversations that I have with my brother about his zeal and his longing for participating in something so great, something so majestic and historic. We were walking in the park by my in-laws' house. I looked up in the sky, and at first, for a moment, I thought I must be having that dream. This uncanny feeling grew in me as a string of dots trained across the entire visible night sky, and it took me a moment to realize that these are Starlink satellites, that the world is changing. Recently in the Future Fossils Facebook group, we had an interesting kind of contentious conversation about Starlink, and I should say that, I was a fan of Robert Zubrin's Case for Mars in high school. I've always been future-oriented, but now here I am at the ripe old age of 37, and it troubles me. It's a strange feeling to get what you've always wanted, but by the time it becomes real, of course, it's different than you imagined or expected. I suspect a lot of people are feeling like that now. As the space industry finally gets off the ground, we live in an age when amazing things are possible, and yet it's not lost on most of the people that I speak to that the richest people to have ever lived are empowered by technologies that evolve faster than the regulatory frameworks and the process of governance originally derived to prevent unusually powerful people from unilaterally deciding on the future of civilization. By Future Fossils episode 121 with Divya Prasad, I had become deeply concerned that space no longer held the potential to be this great unifying visionary frontier, but just another perceived terra nullius for us to exploit, fight over, reshape in our own distorted image. And yet, What did I expect, really? I've always been a proponent of the Chinese proverb, let 100 flowers bloom. It takes work, practice, to stretch wide enough, to learn to accept everything that is, to invite everything possible. And ultimately, regardless of the angles that each of us take on it, that is the promise of space. Room to explore, freedom to begin anew, the opportunity to grow beyond. So today, I ask some difficult questions, but I do so out of love, both for this planet and for what we can become by striving to transcend it. Before we dive in, I want to thank everyone supporting the show on Patreon and encourage you to do the same. By keeping Future Fossils listeners supported, I'm engaged in something that reflects the ethos of the kind of community I am committed to growing and to nourishing. I don't take my creative freedom for granted, and I don't like the thought of compromising the weirdness of this show with venture capital. It means the world to me to know that the people who show up to support Future Fossils for $2, $5, $10 a month do so because they believe in the merit, the worth of these discussions, the time that I invest in them. It means that you actually appreciate the work that is being done here. And in turn, that means that I'm not using you, dear listeners, as products. I'm not selling your attention to someone else in order to take care of my family. And as someone who works in social media by day, I feel pretty good about that decision. So a special thanks to the new patrons and upgraded patrons this last couple weeks. Doug Barton, Dr. Blue, episode 124, if you want to go back. His was great. Joseph Kelly, David Campbell, and everyone else who continues to chip in. If we were all hanging out in the same room, it would be the best party ever. If you've been on the fence about supporting this show, you should know that last week I started a new series of patrons-only bi-weekly episodes that I'm going to treat as the kind of skunk works of this show. Last week I read and commented on my 2016 essay, The Future is Disgusting. Next week, I'm going to preview my latest studio single, a tune about Jurassic Park, and about hyperstition, the runaway effects of our creativity and imagination let loose upon the world. Actually, my exegesis of that song, Life Finds a Way, will make for an excellent follow-up to this episode, and I have been toiling away at this track in secrecy for months, so I look forward to sharing it with all of the $5 and up patrons next week. Also, all levels of patronage get to participate in the Future Fossils Book Club. Our book for June will be Eric Wargo's Precognitive Dream Work and The Long Self, which I am very excited to announce he will be joining us for that book club call. You can go back to listen to episode 117 when Eric joins us to talk about his first book, Time Loops. The second book is a much more practical, hands-on exploration of time as a kind of information crystal and the profound epistemic shift that occurs when you engage this with a research praxis. So that's going to be really fun, and I hope that you will be there to investigate this richness with us. But for now, I would like to introduce you to Robert Jacobson of Arch Mission, which is an extremely cool project I highly recommend you look up, and author of Space is Open for Business. Check the show notes for a link to the Discord server to discuss this episode with other interesting people. And thanks for listening.
If I really nitpick, because I knew some of the producers, they could have probably, it's an hour and a half, they probably could have cut 15, 20 minutes. There's a little bit of redundancy, but I think they just were trying to get all of their friends and kind of the proverbial talking heads all in there. You know, that's what they got. But it's good. It's very solid.
Well, maybe that's the right place to start, right?
Sure.
Jerry O'Neill, The High Frontier, totally amazing visionary book, just made into a documentary, saw the trailer for it, got so excited to see this film. We're at a time now where a lot of this stuff, it's not just space, it's AI, it's all sorts of science fictional kind of domains that we've kind of, as a species, seem to have just gotten used to them being fiction. But all of the technology is accelerating and converging in a way that is bringing this stuff into being while we've sort of fallen asleep at the wheel in a way. Like everyone's just sort of used to it being imaginary future land. And now it's actually happening. And here we are. So like what I'd like to do with you, Robert, is you've written this amazing argument or introduction or however you want to describe it, that space is open for business. You've written this book that makes a really clear and compelling case for space as a frontier of economic opportunity and a new domain or arena for innovation. I was thinking about myself as like a kind of a critical futurist or someone who always has to stake myself in an opposing position in a dialectic so as to further the dialectic. And so out of respect for you and out of respect for the importance of these ideas, I think the right thing to do, and I'm just guessing that a lot of the press coverage that you're going to get for this book is just purely sympathetic. What I'd like to do is just hang out with you in the brave space of like actually examining your thoughts as someone who has given so much more attention to this than I have about the challenges and the complications of moving into space and see where you stand on it. But like before we do that, I'd like for you to just introduce yourself to people and talk about your background and how you ended up writing this book in the first place.
Certainly. I'm very excited to be here because I love your true diversity of thought that you present on your podcast. And what I'll share is that I didn't come from like the space sector initially. I grew up in the state of Florida in the shadow of the space shuttle. And like many kids probably in late 20th century US, like, what do you want to be? It's like fireman, doctor, astronauts, usually many times peppered in there. And because it was such a strong voice in Florida, it was with me as just a small child. And I think it was also in part to my father, was a science fiction fan. He seemed to like campy science fiction. And he took me to see films. And on Saturdays, we would watch, like afternoons, we would watch science fiction films and old Star Trek together. And it all was one kind of gumbo. It was just like a gumbo. It was all mixed in together. And it kind of seeded me into the future can be cool and great. And I was more interested in like this, I'm not going to say utopian, but positive science fiction. All the stuff with battles, wars, and or dystopian. I kind of recognized early on that this just makes for like good dramatic elements, but it's not necessarily a world that I wanted to inhabit. And I even went to space camp and I thought, gosh, I want to be an astronaut. But I quickly realized pretty much in high school that this was probably not good. Becoming a NASA astronaut was not going to be my path. In part because generally you had to do a military service route, which I didn't feel was a good fit for me. And it was about following check boxes, orders, being really very kind of linear. And it was great for some individuals. I said, okay, it's fine. I'm going to do other things. And my interest very deeply in high school was around music. And in school, I ended up going in undergrad to studying both music and business, kind of in parallel routes, because I had this always entrepreneurial bent. And then I kind of quickly realized that actually being a musician was to survive or something, you had to be very entrepreneurial, but not necessarily thinking about it in that terms of parlance. You're just trying to like get gigs, hustle, take internships, do whatever to survive. And then the early 2000s, I'd heard about the X Prize just as like an idea, but didn't know how real it was. And then it was like, I think in 03, 04, the first X Prize competition happened in 04. I really started tracking it in a little more serious way. I said, okay, this is something significant. Maybe this is going to be the catalyst for something great. And I had been working also a day job in the commercial real estate sector. And I'll never forget, it was around, I think it's June 20th or June 21st, 2004. I believe it's June 20th, 2004. I'm playing a music festival underneath the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles.
Wait. Under your own name or?
I was playing with several groups, and I've actually been trying to find the original program. I played with 2 or 3 groups that night. The festival was called Ear Jam. It was run for several years by Julie Adler and another individual. And I played with a couple different groups during that. But backstage, it was wrapping up, 10 or 11 o'clock at night. I was telling people, I said, hey, there's going to be like this private rocket launch out in the town of Mojave, which is about 2 hours north of LA. Who wants to roll out there? It's a Sunday night. And people are like, sounds cool, but no. Well, I got one buddy of mine, Scott Farr. He rolled out with me. We didn't leave till 2 a.m. We got there 3 or maybe 4 a.m. It's dark. And there was thousands of people out there, but it was like, this is 2004. There's like no Facebook. Nobody's sending messages to each other. There's nothing. It was a very kind of organic, just people showing up with an idea that sometime in the next 12 hours, there might be a space launch. Really not a whole lot of detail that I was provided. And I ended up seeing that launch, and it changed my life. I said, I'm going to be involved. I'm not sure how. And I just immediately started realigning and reorienting activities to be involved in the space sector. Now, 2021, I worked with an investment fund, actually sort of several, including a group called the Space Angels Network, participating in several successful space missions through the Arc Mission Foundation, which I'm on the crew of. I ended up going back to doing some schooling with International Space University in 2016, working, investing in a lot of different startups, and both initiating and helping, enabling, advising, investing. But it was just kind of like this. I felt I was still a little too early in 2004 because the sector was still kind of early, but it was the perfect time for me. Although a lot of things were maybe early for the commercial side. And now I released this book, Space is Open for Business, and I have an advisory group called Space Advisors. But part of the title was I wanted something kind of broad and open-ended. But when I use the term business, it's not just about like our old ways or whatever somebody might think of as a current way of doing business. I'm using it in a very broad and in somewhat ambiguous sense that I'm just suggesting that space is becoming more open for all of us, and it's in the price and access to space is becoming lower, more accessible. And for those who just want to do things and freely create in space, I think it's that opportunity, as long as they're doing so peacefully. I don't think every person will need to be astropreneur or build a space company. I think it's infrastructure right now that's being created that will facilitate and enable humanity to do and create new types of applications, tools. Some things will work, some things won't. I think we'll probably see early days some really, it's like silly YouTube type of stuff. You're like, what happens if we do this in microgravity? But it might be like an independently sponsored type of activity. And we have so many challenges socially, politically, economically here on Earth. Space feels like it really could be one of those, a bright spot. We could develop solutions. It might come out of some sort of serendipity in terms of our challenges here on Earth. It tends to actually still provide some, under diplomatic context, a little bit of a safeguard. On the International Space Station right now, Russia and the United States have to cooperate as long as they both have Russian and then respectively U.S. crew on board and other nationalities. But they're up there 365 days a year and have to be kept, alive and safe. So space can have these sort of softer diplomatic aspects to it too. But we also now have this, as we have this emergence of these high-profile individuals who are leading space companies with almost the power and strength of government agencies comparatively, we do have to ask ourselves, how do we not recreate all of our, let's just say, less than positive aspects of humanity as we go out into space? And that's, I think, a good segue into the documentary you're talking about, which is the High Frontier, a documentary about the life of Dr. Gerard O'Neill, who has been kind of a guiding light for many people in this kind of emerging space area. And unfortunately, he passed away, I guess it was in 92. So he didn't get to see all of what is being created now, but he's a bit of the superstar.
Yeah. So, wow, a lot there. First of all, I also grew up in Florida and remember the space shuttle through the whole state. Like you could hear, the supersonic booms. You could see it going up sometimes. We would all be led out from school into the yard,
Yeah.
like into the PE fields and stuff to watch the launches. And my brother, who's an aerospace engineering student at Wichita State University, has actually gone down and watched the Falcon Heavy launch and stuff like that. And so growing up in that environment, my dad worked for Disney. So like growing up in that environment, there is that sense of the visionary horizon, that sort of like Epcot thing. But being part of a family that goes into Disney through the crew member entrance, I was always aware of this other part of it, which is like how the sausage gets made part of it, and I've grown up with this really deep awareness or a great sensitivity to the distinction between the rhetoric and the promise of a given vision and the sort of gritty details of its reality. And you address a lot of this stuff in this book. When I had John David Ebert on the show back in episode 65, we were talking about Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, which I think is relevant here in its depiction of a K-shaped future for human species, like a split between the Earth-based economy and the economy beyond Earth, on off-world colonies, et cetera. One of the things that we talked about was the blind spots in these techno-utopian visions, Fordlandia down in Brazil or Epcot itself. Mark Nelson was on the show, who was one of the 8 people that locked themselves inside Biosphere 2 in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. And it's like that's actually a really great example of like the kind of tensions that you're talking about here, because in their efforts to miniaturize the biosphere and reproduce it in an enclosed environment as like a laboratory experiment, they knew that there was going to be a lot of unknowns and that the small scale of the experiment was going to amplify these feedback loops, and it was going to make certain things, like in their case, the greenhouse effect and overproduction of CO2, really, really quick and obvious. And another thing that amplified and accelerated was interpersonal tensions between people. There's very few redundancies when you try to minimize like a minimal viable ecosystem inside of a structure like that. And conflict becomes a lot more obvious at shorter timescales. And so all of this is just to provide some background on the challenges of getting out into this space. But just to like stake it there, I want you to provide first a sort of positive statement or a thesis of what you see as possible and what you articulate as possible in space, and like the opportunity that is availing itself to us here, and why you seem to believe that we would be fools to ignore it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunities are almost limitless, but to give some opportunities would be, first of all, an even better knowing and measurement of our changing planet. I think the opportunity to create new materials, new medicines, some of the new kind of hard tech, utilizing kind of the environment of space that will benefit from humanity. The moon, which is just a close neighbor, celestial body, just a few days away from us, could be this great training ground and playground for us to figure out how we can like do things in the rest of the solar system. But the balance is, and I talk about this in the book, is that it should not just be that it's not like the resources on the other planets and moons are limitless. They only have so much mass. There's only so much material there, that we actually do need to start thinking about and defining that we will keep certain areas wilderness and untouched. And if we start thinking about the more smarter allocation of resources, history is going to thank us for keeping that in mind. Now, it is a little difficult when you're just trying at the moment, just going, well, we're just figuring out how to walk. We don't even know how to walk, let alone mine the moon and stuff. A lot of it's still kind of theoretical or laboratory environment. So we don't need to really worry about that the mine's going to get strip mined. But as you're referring to earlier, the progress of advancement is happening so quickly in different places, and sometimes we could be caught like the frog in the water boiling, that all of a sudden, left unchecked, there are, you could have a nation state taking, despite whatever the Outer Space Treaty says, could say, you know what, we are taking this pole on the moon, or both poles, and we are making a very large security exclusion zone. And you can select which nation state actors might do this. And then all of a sudden, other nation states, the rest of humanity might not have access to those resources. So I think we have to more fervently talk about these issues and start figuring it out. And maybe there are ways that we'll be able to use, maybe it's leveraging things, whether it's blockchain or AI, things to kind of help make all the transactional types of parts of this more fair or more equitable for the rest of us on humanity. And I think it's, as I said from the beginning, the moniker of business is just a label, in part because money has been such an important and dominant theme in many parts of human civilization for such a long time. It seemed like, okay, I just can't sell the story of space. Let's tie it in with a common theme. Many people, or most people, recognize the concept of money and business and commerce and how that works. And it can be enabling. It's just my wish, if I could have one, is just that we just start to improve our behavior out there, because there is, of course, there's going to be pushback, and there's people who can say, well, gosh, we're just going to repeat all of our bad behavior, but in another place. And that's completely, all these things are possible. But I think if it takes us as an individual, whether we're involved in industry or not, to at least just start thinking about this, because small steps can make change, and small steps with especially large collective groups can potentially really affect this both present that we're in and this future that we're creating. So space could be this multi-generational plan for humanity, because the facts is that there are many near Earth objects. This is that within 75 to 100 years could potential existential threats to large amounts of populace here on the Earth. And you could say, well, that sucks for you, but if it was your family or loved one or someone you knew, you probably wouldn't wish for them to be wiped out in that type of event. So why not start thinking about ways to just create other insurance policies? And while we create those insurance policies as having backups of our knowledge and humans off the planet Earth, we will develop new tools and techniques that will hopefully improve life on the planet Earth. And if there was one major takeaway, I do believe that space could provide a way to increase the standard of living for all of the human population that wants that. I'm not trying to say, hey, we're going to force an indigenous group somewhere to say, hey, you got to leave and just start over on this O'Neill style cylinder. But I'm saying I think we could improve the quality of life, because we are dealing with these threats of climate change. As much as right now we're dealing with the pandemic, which is still affecting some parts more greatly than others, it's climate change is kind of happening. And it was through space assets. That was one of the very early ways that we got a little bit of an idea of what that was. Even though there was discussion about, I think, carbon dioxide atmosphere back in the 19th century, but it was really much later, 100 plus years later, that we had other tools to sort of verify and say, okay, there's something going on here on the planet that we might be affecting.
Yeah, so actually that's a good point that I think a lot of people miss in this discussion. That when I had Tanya Harrison on the show, I don't know if you're familiar.
I know of her, yeah.
Yeah, so she works for Planet Labs, and she made the point that a lot, at least at this point in the development of things, that a lot of space initiatives are actually about increasing our awareness of this planet and, better mapping flows of things. I remember a related initiative I was talking with somebody who manages projects for DARPA a few years ago, who said that one of the things that they were working on was using satellite imagery to detect overfishing by measuring hull displacement of every boat on every body of water in the world. The way that empowers us to take the quote unquote God's eye view of things and to better understand the Earth as a single system, be it from the Carl Sagan blue marble kind of thinking to this other far more instrumental view. I think that's a huge piece of it. But that ties in with two things, one of which is the sort of metabolic dimension of that. And, you speak to money. And I do think that the dynamics of money for thermodynamic reasons can't be figured out. And I want to get there. But before we get there, I want to talk about regulation, because like this book, you've got a foreword by David Rose. He was an associate founder of Singularity University. I think it's very clear from the way that this book is framed that your audience is largely people that fall within a particular demographic, I would call sort of Silicon Valley and adjacent, entrepreneurial thinking, innovation and disruption focused. And the implicit there is that this should happen. And, you talk a lot about the history of which Earth-based agencies should be in charge of regulating different departments. I found it really interesting that you mention that the DOT authority exceeds that of both NASA and the Department of Defense on certain things. And it's just like certain aspects of this don't transpose. And then there's the other problem of the pace of technological innovation is based on network bonuses that you don't find in government. It innately outpaces government regulation. So there's two pieces here to that. And I'll stop here and let you unpack this, which is, on the one hand, we have this hopelessly antiquated regulatory system that still has currently power to squash this, and that's portrayed in a let my people go kind of way, by this argument that this is a bad thing for the future of the human species. And in many ways, I completely agree. Then there's this other part, which is that if you look at any complex system, be it, take the human body and the way that costly signaling is deployed by the human body to prevent malignant cells from requisitioning too many resources from the body to fuel their own sort of selfish efforts. And, when I think about the role of inhibitory regulation in a swiftly evolving tech space, be it space or any other space, I can't help but think that the frustration is essential and innately good in some respects, because if you think about like cancer biology, it's about somebody hacking their way into this kind of explosive growth regime whereby the needs of a particular group of cells become decoupled from the needs of the system in which they were originally participating. You can think like the human discovery of fossil fuel in this way. So like this is sort of a broader conversation around the exploitation of previously stranded resources in the ongoing technological evolution of civilization, and our ability to actually keep pace with our own explosive growth that I think becomes extremely pointed in conversations about the development of a space economy, where you're talking about private actors that started out with access to, nation level power and influence, but then they go lasso an asteroid that's worth more than the entire planetary economy. And, you get into these questions like those explored humorously by the Facebook group, Elon Musk is a supervillain, comparing him to Palmer Eldritch from Philip K. Dick's novel, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And you wonder, how on earth do we possibly keep regulatory pace with this stuff? So like, that's a ton to consider, but I'd love to know kind of how you navigate that.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So for somebody who wanted to, you've got the name fossils in your podcast. So I want to talk about, it seems like fossil fuels and the energy that we have got that from, and I've heard this before, that this was a gift from nature and we have exploited it. We have used it. Now we don't have this opportunity again. If we really screw things up even further, and we've made so many mistakes, but if we really continue to mess things up, use up all that resource, use up all the other natural resources, we don't have another savings account to go back to that would allow us even to go off planet Earth. So that's one reason why I think people like an Elon Musk are highly motivated, because they recognize that there's this finite resource. If we don't kind of get ahead of these things, we're not going to be able to go back. We're going to be trapped here, most likely. So there's that. And we now just are kind of like, and there's, putting their best effort. Blue Origin, Boeing, NASA, they're all kind of scrambling, but sometimes with their own priorities. Regarding Elon Musk being kind of like this he's a cult of personality. He is a human. He does try. He is trying to build a vision of science fiction, the type of science fiction that is debatable. What is potentially a little bit challenging and maybe even could be scary, could cause some fear, real fear, is that he is building a tremendous transportation infrastructure to space. He's gaining traction. He just won a contract with the moon. There's increasing number of other experts in the industry who think that there needs to be additional launch providers just so that there's not all just one-stop shopping. SpaceX is also creating Starlink, which could be global telecommunications platform. So he's also got an energy company. He is also working on in areas around AI. He's also working on types of engines that their prime fuel he could potentially control the access points to. If you take all of that and saying, I'm going to start dominating areas around energy, transportation, space transportation, all these things, he really could do some very nefarious things if he or other enablers allow him to. I don't know that answer. Does he wake up thinking that's exactly what he wants to do or not? I don't. But and I do believe there are the rabid fans that just want to follow him to Mars and go do that. But I think most people will realize, unless they're just completely, a hardcore meditator or something, they're not going to be able to spend 6 months with just a few other people, and it's not going to be without tension. You could be with your 50 or 100 of your very best friends, but you're going to be essentially in a can, and you're going to be going 6 to 8 months to get to this place. And there's going to be some definitely psychological bumps along the way. We don't have that part figured out yet in terms of how to get humans to thrive in these extreme environments. Oh, as you were saying, in a vessel, and then a mechanical structure, and then you can't even walk. It's not like Biosphere 2. You can't even walk out the door if you're like, I'm out. You're like, no, there is no out. It's like if you out, you're in the vacuum of space. And then once you get to Mars or another, say, any celestial body, that celestial body in our solar system is still not suited for human life. We have to adapt to it or put safeguards. So, and although I think it's still good exercise for us to go do it, and maybe over time we'll figure this out. You think of a place in your mind on Earth that you never want to be. That place is still probably better than the environment on these other celestial bodies currently. And so I think the governments are recognizing that, the cost of access to space is becoming less, in part because of all these other technology enablers, where there's all this nexus of, maybe some would say, we're hitting the singularity. I'm going, no, it's not what Kurzweil defined as the singularity. It's something else, because it's also just not a singular event. It's many events. But in regards to space, it's the price of accessing space, predictability on when you would get your, whatever mass you're trying to take there. I think governments want to enable, because they are looking for ways to inspire their citizens. They are looking for new tax revenue. They're looking for new enabling technologies. Space is the strategic high ground. That's why the U.S. Air Force looked back, I think, back in the 50s. They had studies looking at putting a human crewed base on the moon. Why? Because, if you have you could look out at all the satellites around the Earth. If you're at the moon, that's you're even further away. There's instead of just being on Mount Everest right at the top of the Earth, be in space or even further out, so you can see all the other activities. So there's still this going on. But in terms of the way government operates, they operate slowly, because their governments are not they're not optimized for efficiency. And it's kind of like when you pay your taxes, it's not like you get to choose where your tax money gets to go, or saying that was a waste of money, I'm just going to defund this and choose that. It's just not the way it currently works. But I do see potential bright spots where government seems more receptive to these new technology areas, and maybe it's enabling areas maybe it's a blockchain or something that could help make government process smarter and better. And I think many times it's not optimized because there's certain, frankly, safe jobs in the bureaucracy that I'll pick on the post office. I love getting my mail, even if it's the junk mail, and I appreciate that service. But we know it could be done better, and there's ways to improve this and other basic government functions. But government's concerned about, votes, districts, all this type of short-term thinking. And if we all of a sudden radically started changing certain parts of government, there could be some short-term pain, whether it's financial, emotional, jobs. But what I think we have to start thinking about is that space could help us create what's next. It's like, how do we humans are creative and we can generally do a pretty good job of cooperating. Why not government having a department of imagination and innovation, because all the potential's there, the resources are there. They just, when you have a department or somebody in their cubicle and they're just sort of told, we got to license the satellite this way. And we've been doing it this way so many times. And you're like, well, we could bring in some software to help you and you could do other things. I think we're in this kind of transitional period. And that's me being positive. There's also you could look on another way that government might put more brakes on things through regulations, or not even regulations, just slow funding down and say, you know what, we're going to fund other areas. But the reality is people that say, well, yeah, let's defund NASA, or defund that. Well, I said, well, look, there's currently no ATMs or banks in space. All the money that is spent in space is currently spent back on Earth, and it does provide people real jobs, whether they're, government funded or private funded. They're real jobs, and there's contractors and subcontractors. So for those who are just kind of like, how does it help me? How does it help my district, my neighborhood? You can probably look around and probably find some type of contractor that has a space related or aerospace related funding from the government. And I was trying to pick different pieces in your statement. So I don't know if I kind of hit them all, and I wasn't trying to.
Well, yeah, no, this is great. Let me refine it a little bit here. I think about if we look at the last year and we look at the way that economies of scale delivered massive returns due to being able to fold efficiency gains back into themselves. This is like true of the way that, looking at Jeffrey West's work at the Santa Fe Institute. And he talks about the way that as a city doubles in population, infrastructure doubles at 85% the speed, and innovation doubles at 115% the speed. So you get all of these infrastructural gains that are folded back into creating more opportunities to increase the rate of social interactions that then lead to higher income per capita, higher patents per capita, and so on. But this is he defines this as an unsustainable process ultimately, because you are ratcheting up into an ever greater crisis innovation cycle. Any innovation has unintended consequences. That's the nature of innovation. Penn State English professor Richard Doyle talks about this as a trope in trip report literature, as the mistake, because the nature of mind expansion is that you always realize after the fact that you missed some important variable, right? And so it's I should have weighed that out precisely rather than eyeballing it, or maybe it was a bad idea to take mushrooms and go to the mall. These things are only apparent in retrospect, and there is something innately Michael Crichton about expanding the surface area of humankind at a super exponential pace. There's a lot of different ways to cut into this problem. And like I mentioned earlier, one of them is just about the properties of networks themselves. Like I was saying, the coronavirus showed us that economies of scale are actually really not great at responding to novel challenges. There's a sense in which things fragment naturally as a response to a kind of scatter, adapt, and remember, to borrow a term from Annalee Newitz, that we respond to crisis by breaking up and huddling out into breakout groups and coming up with different responses to that crisis that are able to, innovate a little better than these large, slow collective computations. So trying to wrangle this into, an actual statement that you can work with. Part of it is that I think the regulatory inhibition of all of this through incumbent systems and all of their baggage and nonsense is actually helping dampen an explosive growth that would make us more brittle and more vulnerable in some respect. Ecologist Bob May in 1972 published this seminal paper on how as an ecosystem grows in complexity, it actually becomes more fragile, more susceptible to collapse, which is precisely the opposite of what intuitively we think about these things. You mentioned a good example about this in the book in terms of the way that a space-based economy becomes so much more vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse disruption, to something like a Carrington event level solar flare or a nuclear attack. And this begs the question about a Fermi's paradox inquiry. Is it possible that there's a bottleneck here where we end up sort of chasing the carrot of all of this new possibility and wealth and opportunity off a cliff? There's a sense in which I worry that we overextend ourselves and become brittle as a civilization. That's part of it. The other part is that, when you look at the last 40 years of tech innovation and where the wealth has actually condensated, you look at like why we even have a private space industry doing so well right now. And it's because of people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk that are reaping by orders of magnitude the lion's share of the wealth that has been created over the last few decades. And so when you look at the global economy as a kind of like superorganism, you talk to economists like Brian Arthur, who suggests that it gets to a certain point and you need a wealth distribution infrastructure like a circulatory system, because the organism has scaled to a certain size where passive distribution of wealth just doesn't work anymore. And so you're seeing this massive increase in inequality and a decoupling of labor from capital. And like this becomes extremely important in the context of like what you were just saying about how we still don't understand how to actually get people into space long term.
We don't even know if a mother can have a child. It might require 1G, maybe not 0.9, right, not 1.1, 0.5. It might require 1 Earth gravity. And if that statement is true, for it to have for a fetus to come to full term, and if that is a true state and kind of as far as we know, absolute, that's kind of a really big deal, because that means so you can't procreate on the moon, you can't procreate on Mars. And then the things like O'Neill colonies or settlements, bases where you become private space stations, government station become where you would need artificial gravity. But I'm just a little concerned that like all of our rush, like you're talking about, like you having a concentration of a few individuals that are making all the choices. And they're sort of saying, well, we're doing all this so that the rest of you can have this great future. But yet, why not still be accountable for here on Earth and treating labor well, treating, your teams well? Let's just take it to like, if you've got a logistics company, i.e. something like Amazon, which people are becoming more dependent and fragile on, all of a sudden you're making lots of people dependent on that. And if there's some issue with then you could potentially mess up, there's all sorts of other dependencies or bottlenecks that you don't even know might get affected. And, you've got the environmental issues, and you can say, oh, well, like they've got policies and they've got a department. So going, well, maybe that's not good enough. Maybe there's something greater that has to, because I think this stuff has to happen in parallel. My wife, I don't know if she's going to want to be quoted here, but we were talking about, she heard in the documentary that part of one of the high profile individuals' goals is to extend consciousness in the space into the solar system. And I joked about some trolling that this individual was doing against another high profile person just this past week on Twitter. And she said, that's not a good example of bringing consciousness into the solar system. So, and I'm not saying that there is no perfect human, but I'm saying but if you're going to have this kind of standard where you are trying to do this really magnanimous thing, I think other parts of your life and organizational, the way you organize your life through business practice and stuff, might want to be a little bit reflective of that higher base. Because it's sort of like saying what's that little company, Google said, we're going to do no evil. And then there are all these things where they were potentially enabling some questionable practices by other governments. So don't just make these phrases a moniker. Practice, not just preach. And as humans, we all have different philosophies how we can get there. And even if it means that we have to go maybe a little more slower, or maybe I'll use this overused expression, be a little more mindful of things, but it is going to be important, because this activity of opening up the space frontier is so incredibly, I think, important, and is going to affect us in the rest of Spaceship Earth in so many ways. We won't get it all right. Let's do a better job of increasing our, of getting it, improving the outcome.
Absolutely. I'm in alignment with that. But there's like you mentioned earlier, the unenforceability. It's like you kind of need space cops or something, and it doesn't make sense. As you mentioned in your book, it doesn't actually make sense to have them yet. It's also kind of impossible to have them without all of this breaking the ground, so to speak, and like creating the infrastructure to afford that kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's the chicken and egg sort of issue. I mean, like, I kind of think that, like, okay, Space Force was sort of, US Space Force was like an attempt, but before Space Force, there were papers being and ideas being kind of shuffled around and debated around something that would look, that the analog, instead of going with the Space Force, was looking at something like the US Coast Guard, or a Coast Guard being something that would be really tasked on monitoring orbital debris, rescuing spacecraft, kind of protection, rescue, safeguard, not have the appearance of offensive capability. Even if Space Force right now does not have that, it could. And those who are proponents will say, well, yes, it's supposed to be a deterrent for what they'll say are bad actors. But there's some interesting thing. There are some people talking about putting some ledger systems and building some, so much an index, but a way that you would start categorizing and recording all the different assets in space, both natural and kind of artificial, so that you could have, like, monitoring kind of who controls what, or maybe you could have financial transactions, leveraging those. And I think some of that could potentially be used for governance. Whether government's ever willing to, again, turn over the keys to things like software, ultimately, call it AI or advanced software, I'm not sure in our lifetime yet, but because, again, it's like, we know there are probably simpler ways of collecting taxes, but are you going to be the one to be able to dismantle the entire IRS and that behemoth? Doubtful.
Right. I mean, and at that point, it's really clear, I think Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars Trilogy does a good job of articulating this, that it doesn't actually make sense to try and extend our current regulatory infrastructure into space. Just as you look at every major evolutionary transition, if you will, of human population size, like civilizational architecture and the way that information systems govern those and have grown over time. You see radical innovations in information technology emerging in order to facilitate like a new structure. So, like, I agree with you that it would seem that some kind of distributed ledger, smart contract type thing is going to be necessary. And then also that I gave the downside of, having this enormous surface area, but the positive has already been articulated very well by people like Robert Zubrin, that we still need a frontier in order to not completely ossify. Like, there needs to be stem cell production in your bones or something, at least, in order to keep this thing alive.
Yeah. And back to, like, the resource utilization is that we should be part of the reason that we would set aside resources not to be touched for a long time is that we might need some of those additional resources when we want to extend humanity outside of the solar system. And if we were to kind of use up all the meaningful resources, then we would truly be stuck on the island of the solar system. And it's tough for people to get their head around. And for those, I think, who, if there are people who don't necessarily want to play in this current paradigm, I think that space will still allow those to have a choice to say, hey, take your civilization and culture elsewhere. Even if you're not the ones building it, participate, do something. If you've got your crazy ass idea, or maybe it's something just old and ancient and you don't really participate in these Western modalities, I think it's completely great and acceptable that they are done elsewhere in the solar system, that they're transplanted. I think every person or people should have the same access to this playground. And it's fascinating because a lot is happening right now. People don't realize how quickly it's accelerating. If you just go and you look about a decade, you look at the 1980s or 1990s, when launches would happen, and might be one every couple of weeks somewhere around the world. And they're generally launching satellites, maybe a space shuttle launch every few months or so. And now you have groups like SpaceX that are just it's happening like almost every week or every other week. There's a SpaceX launch, and there's other launch providers that have been inspired and motivated by them. And a big dog in the room, which there's still some opacity to it, or at least to me, is China, People's Republic of China. Like, how are they going to? They're giving like all sorts of mixed signals. There's something called the Wolf Amendment, where it basically makes it very difficult for the U.S. and China to do things in space. But recently, a Chinese spokesperson said, hey, maybe we should cooperate in space. But then in the same month, they'd say, we're going to be doing this with Russia. And going, well, that sends some signals to the rest of the world. And China, now they want to build reusability in terms of their rockets. This month, we're recording this in the month of April 2021. They're supposed to launch the first segment of their space station. So there's all these other things that are going to, it's like the genie's out of the bottle. And so if instead of trying to control things, how do we just influence things so that they can optimize the situation and improve it? And hopefully, again, not recreate a lot of the mistakes that humanity continues to sort of make here on Earth. And the pandemic was definitely a great way to demonstrate how the lack of resiliency in some of our systems and many of our systems. And the fact that somebody made a joke to me the other day that said, there was a run on toilet paper, but basically COVID-19 doesn't really cause diarrhea. Let's just say. So that's, a little graphic there, but yet it caused people to run and make a run for those sorts of supplies. So we still have this very primitive way of, and I say primitive in this type of way where we have a way of thinking that's just kind of like not conscious, not aware, maybe even primitive people. When I say primitive in a respectful way, many times had a more conscious way of being aware of the surroundings. I'm suggesting that like a lot of people are not even going, hey, did you ever think about what COVID-19, what the symptoms would be, what we might actually be short on, or medicines? And so, you just sometimes have to laugh at some of this stuff because it's difficult for one to make a change on the outcome. But part of my story and sharing about this book is to hopefully and get lots of people to think about these issues and think about this as it's quickly becoming part of our experience.
Yeah. So to bring this down in a kind of mundane example or like corner that we can use as a case study of how we navigate these issues or fail to. Page 210 of the advanced copy of your book that I have, quotes Scott Cordella, Space Systems Director at the MITRE Corporation, who says, if we're not careful, we face the potential of the tragedy of the commons, where companies will focus on near-term business success rather than long-term sustainability and shared safety of operations. And probably nowhere more obvious is this than in the problem of space debris. So given that you're talking about, how do we not just recreate the problems that we have here? When we're talking about the tragedy of the commons, there's two things. One is that the tragedy of the commons has been shown mathematically to be an insufficiently low-dimensional model of resources in a given system or currencies accessible in a given system. It's assuming that players cannot move away and find another opportunity to acquire the same resources. It's assuming that everyone is competing for the same resources rather than linked together in some sort of circular economy. Mm-hmm. And yet, it does seem if we are optimizing space, which I think the rhetoric of space as an entrepreneurial opportunity runs a very strong risk of doing this, optimizing interest in space for return on investment, be it financial or be it, power dynamics related in other ways, then it does become a problem of like, who's going to pick up the trash? So I'm curious, given that we are like, muddling our way through a way, way, way overdue response, as you mentioned, society tends to work reactively rather than proactively on crafting and enabling intelligent solutions. Whose responsibility are these? Is it to deal with the production of externalities that is created here, and then the fact that there's no one to hold these unprecedentedly powerful individuals and I think more importantly institutions. I think people confuse Elon Musk for like the companies which have their own sort of market incentives and like a will of their own in some respect, and in many, no matter where you look in human society, have basically decoupled from the actual interests of the people that are like constituents or component parts of these institutions. It's the same problem with corporate personhood broadly, which is like, how does a human being hold a Leviathan accountable for running off on its own sort of evolutionary tear and leaving us sucking its exhaust, basically?
Yeah, so there's a few things in place regarding space junk. So like when you're building a satellite, you have to get a license to register to a country, and you have to, fly with a carrier. The launch provider has to have its launch license. And then you pretty much know where you're going to insert that physical object, that space asset, your satellite, where into which orbit. And I'm not a satellite space legal expert, but basically, if it's in LEO, which is low Earth orbit, extends out to a couple thousand miles or so from everything's in free fall, and eventually those satellites are generally designed so that they will decay and burn up in the atmosphere, and it's usually not an issue. Now, it could be an issue if it hits another object. So there's still that's why tracking all assets, whether they're still operational or not, is important, because there have been collisions. Many of these small satellites do not yet have propulsion. They're starting to build that in so they could, move out of the way, go to other orbits. That's a good thing. If you have your big, large communication satellites, the ones that provide your, direct TV, they have to have a budget for some fuel. So at the end of their life, they move the satellite to what they call graveyard orbit when it's not a problem. Now there's recent success. Northrop Grumman did a test just recently where they were able to dock a satellite against another satellite. What this means is that eventually we will be able to refuel satellites and extend their life, which is good. So you can hopefully try to deal with the junk. There was a Japanese startup that just had a first launch, and they're doing a test mission around orbital debris. But the challenge for startup businesses, there's been a few that want to address the debris issues, and they want to advance this because that's their business motivation, it's been difficult to get funding around. There's who's going to pay for this? Is it taxpayers? Is it governments? Is it customers? That's not been figured out. And the current orbital debris issue is difficult. It's challenging. There's everything from little bits of paint-sized specks to large objects, flying around that could all potentially, it's got kinetic energy, could all run into something else, could cause problems. This, something like a Kepler syndrome. But nobody wants to say it's bad enough yet. The community consensus is that we're probably going to have another incident or two we're now the world has to act and make some sort of unilateral decision. I have suggested that one thing that would maybe be complementary to this is that we have a global ban on anti-satellite weapons from Earth or in space. I don't seem to get much love when I mentioned that. I've mentioned that. So, people don't seem to like that. But and an argument is that any moving object in space could be made into a weapon. So it could be a different argument. Said, well, my satellite accidentally bumped into your other satellite. It wasn't, with intention. It wasn't an intentful, unlawful act. So it's going to have to be addressed. I mean, Leonard David wrote this article this month in Scientific American, basically saying that the removal of space junk is not going smoothly. I would say it's barely happening. It's not just it's just they're discussing it, they're tracking it. There's several different core technologies that are being developed in different places around the world, but they're just not even pilot stage yet. They're somewhere between, they're still in the lab, and they just don't really have the right funding mechanism to kind of do something, in space or at scale. The Japanese have seemed to take a particular interest in this area. There's a few which is interesting, and I hope there would be further leadership on that. Lord knows they've not done a very good job on the nuclear energy side here. So hopefully they're not going to use that side as an example for how we deal with orbital debris. I
mean, yeah, no, nothing against the Japanese broadly, because I'm an American and we're shitheads, but you got to look at like the export of cesium-137 and the global consequences of not giving a damn about whaling bans and like, the ecological implications of that. And it's the same thing. So like without lingering on this and hammering on it more than like truly necessary. There's so many other dimensions, and in the limited time that we have to discuss this, I want to give air to more of them. One of which I mentioned earlier, which is the decoupling of labor and capital. It's like, as you said, like if we don't know how to get people into space long term, then space will continue to be the domain of robot exploration. And who owns the robots right now? Just rich people, basically. It's not the 1900s version of an automated leisure economy that we were expecting. And so like there's this massive gap socially and economically between what the kind of space sector that we're building and the quote unquote fully automated luxury gay space communism that some of my friends wear on t-shirts. And so it's like everybody seems to want the Federation of Planets, but everybody is working towards the Ferengi or whatever right now. And so part of the question is, I've heard people argue that actually a lot of the value that would be captured in space, it doesn't even make sense to bring it back to the planet. And then part of it is just this question of the frontier moving on without us and it just being like the domain of robots and this. So I'm curious what you think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess some people say bits and bytes. And for a long time, we've been taking energy and bits, and we're monitoring the Earth, and we're sending, or using it to better relay telephone, communication, radio, TV, imaging. So there's been a lot of that value. That's like the bit side. And then like when you're dealing with atoms, I do think there will be unique things we'll create in the microgravity environments that will be used. Some will be highly specialized, maybe medicine materials. But I don't think it's unrealistic anytime soon we're going to be bringing water back and saying, here's some drinking water, like you don't have to do a lot of measurement to say that probably doesn't seem very feasible. So I think it's a bit of both, where we have like some things in this kind of Leo economy, highly specialized, bringing back to Earth. It's kind of like back and forth, a lot of activity back and forth. The moon is this transfer. It becomes this playground for physical and creative play and intellectual play. And there's a transference back to Earth. Well, there will be some IP, intellectual ideas that will be useful back on Earth, and it'll be like a training ground for how we operate and live both robotically and with humans, and become more like Homo Spacians, a term that Frank White termed out in the rest of the solar system. And so I think it's, again, space is both an enabler, it is a domain and an enabler. I think robots will for almost forever be a necessary component to space, the scouts, to helping us, complementing us, because there's going to be some things that are just too dangerous for us. Like, why are we going to send like 100 astronauts on this asteroid with like proverbial picks when you're going to have a team of a fleet of robots and a few overseers or repair people or service people, or specialists? That seems to me a little more likely to happen. And there's also just some, again, human limitations of just we're soft and squishy and fragile, and the communications are going to be challenges until maybe I've heard it's maybe 20 years out that we have maybe a real commercial operational type of quantum communications infrastructure. And I think if and when we sort of develop that could help maybe leapfrog us in some of the issues where just like the time delays with communication. So there are these kind of like these things where people going, well, gosh, if my friend or my cousin is living on Mars and I have like this 20-minute delay or 10-minute delay, how do I have conversations with them? I said, well, gosh, there potentially might be ways that we could work through that, but it's probably a good 20 years away.
Yeah, that would change everything. And yet, again, I can't get my head out of thinking about what the enormous progress in hyperconnectivity just on Earth has done to emulsifying human culture.
Well, so does that make us a bit more like the Borg rather than the Ferengi here on Earth?
Yeah. And actually, Star Trek did explore relatively well is just how vulnerable the Borg are to, because of a centralized information infrastructure, how vulnerable they are to, a computer virus or this kind of thing. And we saw that with the 2008 bank collapse. The banking network was entirely too correlated. And we know that trading activity becomes dominated by like herd-based following action, that when everybody is just chasing the Dogecoin pump, for example, that's a bad sign.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's
how is when you're doing posts on Twitter or Reddit or pick your medium, and all of a sudden an entire market changes, or a company that when you look at the fundamentals is actually kind of struggling, but then on paper its market value is all of a sudden like dramatically increased. You got to say, like, there is something a little bit wonky and crazy about what's going on, where it used to be kind of in the good old days, it sometimes took like decades to sort of build a business that would have $1 billion of a market cap. And, the people will say, well, no, we have better communication. We have more immediate market data. Supply chains are stronger. You can hire talent, get more optimized. There's all these arguments to sort of say, no, you can grow a business much faster. And that some of that might be true, but you have to sort of say to what effect. And again, if most of the wealth capture is in just a few individuals, life certainly isn't fair, but you have to ask yourself going, do we want a world where it's just fewer individuals that have all this access and other people are kind of basically at their discretion going, maybe we're going to fund this new thing or that, when you have very few individuals that are both playing philanthropist and market maker. And that's kind of the world. So it kind of connects with like some of the space stuff. And I don't have all the right answers. And I'm kind of personally probably somebody that's more middle of the road, but I try to think both rationally. But I'm somebody that wants to have my heart and my mind aligned, not just in my head and not like realizing that there is, humans' lives at stake.
So to that point, you devote sections to this book to both better business models and to new economies. And I think that this conversation has been in low orbit and is now in decaying orbit. Maybe we can land it rather than crash it on the subject of, given all of the issues that we have raised in this call, what do the best minds, because you're steeping in them, like the blurbs for this book are just like a who's who of people, visionaries in this space. What are the best minds in this area thinking about in terms of, everyone is using exponential growth curves, exponentially accelerating innovation and planning ahead, internalizing the disruption rather than just letting the wave hit them, turning and swimming into it. So everybody's assuming that this is going to enable this and is going to enable this, and that in another 10 or 20 years, all of these new things these new opportunities for governance and for incentive structures are going to become possible. And then it's not just going to be about empowering space. It's going to completely transform the way that we organize things back on Earth. So like, what are those people imagining as far as the new economies that are going to open up in 20 to 30 years or whatever time horizon you choose, that are going to not only resolve these problems in space travel, but also in the other problems that we've created for ourselves in the incumbent Earth world life? What do we have to look forward to here in terms of like equity, the closure of manufacturing loops, bringing things back? How does this look more sustainable? How does this look more equal in the years to come?
Well, so there's been some mergers and acquisitions activity, as there are in almost every industry, but there's been a few of some acquisitions by holding companies, private equity groups in the space sector, and they're still looking pretty traditional. Some of the original founders of those companies had and maybe continue to have very visionary ideas, and they started with really a modest first step with a very big audacious goal, and then they took it as far as they could, and they sort of either ran out. And this is I'm just I don't want to give any specific examples here, but they either were just like they basically needed to onboard more financial capital because they kind of ran out of some financial steam. And they said this, bringing on these holding companies or private equity groups as partners would be a way to continue. But these transactions are still very conventional. Founders and early employees got stock and cash into these new companies. So it's still kind of like, where some of these people bought into very, exponential models of like that they learned from, maybe, in say in educational systems that were or new types of educational systems, groups like Singularity University that are promoting thinking about singularity, exponential change and growth, which they are investing in. They're creating space companies. They're trying to build, saying, hey, we know there's this small market need right now, but we have this big vision of doing this. And they're doing that. But in terms of like more fairness or equity, the rest, it's still difficult because they'll say it's fair. They're like, hey, we gave early employees like some stock. Is it enough stock? Is it not enough stock? Who knows? It's debatable.
How is that not a pyramid scheme?
Yeah, exactly. So there's still these, or you have companies that are just, a venture capital firm invests and then they do another round. And it's kind of like they keep pushing the opportunity down because they kind of recognize it might take a long time to get to an exit or profitability. So they keep selling it to another group of investors. So that's kind of the hurdle for me. It's like that. It's not a chasm of death, but it's going, I do think there are these founders, employee and team members who they see the big audacious goal. They've got the near term kind of tactical work that they're doing for this much bigger vision. And I applaud that, but it's still difficult because of like when you were referring to the status of a corporation in our society, it's basically almost more powerful than us as a human, just one individual, and it has this legal status. There's still, and I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but there seems like there's still some change that needs to happen to sort of make this, improve this business part process, saying, hey, you're creating this like things that are futuristic. You want to create a space economy. You're watching TED Talks, you're attending different, maybe non-accredited academic programs, but thought-provoking and make you do real work, but maybe they're unaccredited. But yet it's very difficult for you as a business practitioner today to sort of take those things and saying, why can't I put every bit of time invested onto a blockchain that every person did? There's all these things because most investors can be like, I'm not investing into that. There's too many risks and unknowns. So I don't have the answer, but there's definitely some gaps here. And I think it would be great to see if the space sector attempts to start doing some of that too. Could be, not representational, but could be heralded as a beacon for other industries too. Because imagine if they're saying, gosh, look what they're advancing in the space industry. Let these other terrestrial industries that also start taking advantage of those innovations or that evolutionary process.
Yeah, I mean, it seems related to the problem that Robert David Steele, former CIA agent, depicts in his work, in his campaign for open source intelligence and intelligence sharing between intelligence agencies, where he's like, the argument is Loctite that this would benefit everyone if we stopped regarding this in this like siloed parochial way. A very similar thing is happening in the sciences, where it's like, it's clear that major scientific breakthroughs come at the intersection between these different disciplines, but the whole thing is governed by this incentive structure in academia that actively inhibits that kind of, lateral thinking, that kind of interdisciplinary work, translational and synthetic work. And it's just like such an obvious problem everywhere we look. But to set all of that aside, because we're coming here to the end, and I want to leave it on a note that like, I want to return to the optimism or the hope, at least anyway, that all of this is anchored in. You talked about starting out as an artist, as a musician, and you mentioned early in this call that you still think about this a lot in terms of not just the expansion of economic opportunity, but of the cultural creation in humankind. And you didn't put it this way, but like there is, in the way that you write about it, in the way that Gerard O'Neill wrote about it, in the way that Tanya Harrison wrote about it, and all these other people, a kind of secular spirituality that emerges here. So I would like to just give you an opportunity to riff as we draw to a close on the sort of promise and potential to the human spirit on this frontier. And I think ultimately, even though, again, you put it in very business terms in this book, I think there's a strong argument that in this society, we've got everything completely ass backwards, and that art is not a luxury that is afforded to us by affluence, but art is the wellspring of affluence. Like, it is the very basis of human existence, like this ability to create and express and discuss that which is otherwise ineffable. So yeah, just I'd love to hear you riff on the creative promise of life beyond this planet.
As far as I know, the majority of us were sort of born under these earthly skies. And, we look into the sky at night or in the morning or the twilight, and the sky has been inspiring us. It's inhabited dreams and nightmares, and for almost all of us. And it's, and when you have an opportunity to get a little bit closer look, an immediate way, very immediate access to space is just using binoculars or telescope. Astronomy is a great way to experience space and even just understand the beauty of it and just going, wow, this is just, it's inspirational. And that's where I talk about this ROIII. It's like return on imagination, innovation, and investment, or, flip it around the way you want. It just doesn't have to be about the business, but space is constantly inspiring. And I think as humans, I think creativity and creating and making is part of what we do. And it's been part of our evolution. And for those who say, well, I'm not really creative, say if you're, building a contract, building software, something, it's a type of creativity. It's not necessarily, it has to be the arts. But I do think that more humans actually do hold artistic creativity than we're thought. Many Western paradigms limit us. And I've spent some time in Indonesia, a place I really enjoyed, and spent time in different parts of Indonesia. But I'll speak briefly about Bali, which is maybe more familiar to has lots of tourism. And for those who've been to Bali, you see the arts and culture are permeated through every part, and they're interwoven through daily life, along with the predominant religion is a form of Hinduism that connects animism too. There was a local tradition in Hinduism with animism, and it is completely normal. You'll meet a taxi driver or a business owner, and they're like, yeah, I've got my business, or I got my business thing to make some money. But they will also be a bamboo carver. They will be a dancer. And it is all completely normal and acceptable. And it's something I miss a little bit in our culture, where things are segmented and so highly specialized. Now, granted, there are always going to be those who focus on a single or just a few activities, and that is all they do. And that's fantastic. And they get a certain high level of performance that, because you can only, that's what they're focusing on. But I would tell individuals that I think it's healthy for us to explore the unknown and try different things. Myself as a musician and creator, that has definitely informed and helped my business intuition, being able to think on my feet, being able to kind of improvise in daily life in terms of figuring out problems, or being able to ask or figuring out how to get that solved. And I think that was a helpful part of it was having this, being able to imagine and create very freely, especially when you're dealing with a stressful situation. You're like, gosh, it feels like there's only A or B, but there's actually more answers. And if you just allow yourself to be in a state of awareness, I think that tapping into that side of our creative spirit and the subset, the artistic spirit, does allow that expression. In space as a theme, there's, I think, just infinite amount of stories and ideas and modes that we can create from. Even if you're like, I'm not interested in the business of space, just get out of the business parlance that maybe I have spoken to, or sometimes that I write about, but it's just some of my cultural expression. It doesn't have to be yours. But I'm not trying to superimpose it on anybody. I'm just simply saying is that space is a theme and a route that can open up so many solutions and so many new ways of creativity, new ways of being. And you say new ways of being, well, just imagine, think about, like, if you were, say, in one of these O'Neill sort of structures where you have 1 G of gravity on the outside, it's like Earth. You could have lakes, you could have little hills, you could have riding on a bicycle, perfectly normal. But you take a little 10-minute journey to the middle of this cylinder where it's microgravity, and you have people doing aerial ballet and doing a microgravity research, that could be an additional complementary way of being. And it's not an either or. It's something that humanity might be able to have these multi-modes of expression with.
Yeah, certainly. We just finished book clubbing Greg Egan's novel Distress for Future Fossils. And that book ends with this vision of an explosive radiative diversification of humankind, where it's like we realize that the only thing that we actually have in common is a shared physics. And so we give up this power conflict over what it means to be human or what it means to be healthy. And it enables this effloration of human expression to a truly post-human situation in which code poets are writing in biology, and we become an entire, not just the superhumans living in orbit versus the workaday fucks stranded in the gravity well, but like a truly magnificent display of, to borrow that Chinese term, like let 100 flowers bloom. So yeah, it is such a beautiful and passionate and inspiring thing. And I just really, what hope I have that we're not going to accidentally destroy ourselves in the process of realizing this dream, I have through the work of people like you and of your friend and colleague, Armin Ellis at Arc Mission. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to talk. Before you go, any last thoughts or pointers or places? Obviously, people should read your book. What else should people know to follow up on this?
Well, this documentary, The High Frontier, is probably going to be a potential touchstone for this conversation. I think people should should do anything, but I mean, I like to think of the world has a lot of gray, and I don't have everything figured out in the book. What I try to do is explain that there's some of the possible verticals that are emerging, and here's some of the possibilities. And if one wants to play in this arena professionally or personally or more, there are many different routes. And don't let anybody tell you no, that you can't or are unable to, that there are many possibilities. And if you're kind of like, struggling, saying, well, I'm interested in this, reading people like Zubrin, some of the hard science fiction is good, like Heinlein, Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, you kind of can't go wrong with some of that. There's many great thought leaders all, kind of sharing, find what resonates with you, take what works, leave the rest. I have a professional consulting practice where I do work with organizations regarding who are interested in developing a space strategy, and we work with select startups. Arc Mission is an area where we're backing up human heritage on and off planet Earth. So that's a great way to connect, where we've got some future missions for 2021 and beyond that we're advancing. And it was great to speak with you and to share a lot from my insights. And I'm kind of humbled by many of the guests that you've had on. So I feel very fortunate to be able to have some time with you today.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Have a good one. And
thank you, Mike.
I'll see you in or from orbit.
Thanks again for listening. Future Fossils is an independent, entirely listener-supported program. If you believe in the work that I'm doing and you want to help see it thrive into the unimaginable future, then you can avail yourself of all of the backstage goodies at patreon.com/Michael Garfield. Or you can just leave a review at Apple Podcasts. That's more helpful than you know. Reach out to me personally at Michael Garfield on Twitter or Instagram, and have a wonderful eon.